In 1938, Adolf Hitler ordered the Holy Roman Empire's regalia, including the lance later romanticized as the Spear of Destiny, taken from Vienna to Nuremberg. That part is documented. Why he wanted it is where the record begins to darken. You have probably heard the legend already that Hitler believed this spear could confer world power, that he hunted it like a man chasing a curse, that the fate of the Third Reich somehow moved with a relic in a glass case. The truth is more dangerous than that. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear may change how you see history itself. Much of the story you think you know did not come from wartime archives at all. To understand Hitler's search for the Spear of Destiny, you have to begin long before the Nazis, long before the swastika banners, or long before the word occult was draped over everything like smoke. You have to begin with an object that was already ancient when Europe was still learning how to imagine empire. Documented fact, the Holy Lance in Vienna was part of the imperial regalia of the Holy Roman Empire, a collection of objects invested with enormous symbolic authority. Documented fact, Emperor Sigismund gave the regalia to Nuremberg in 1423, and by 1424 they were there, where they remained for centuries until the French Revolutionary Wars drove them away. In 1800 the regalia were moved to Vienna. There they stayed until Hitler brought them back. Imagine standing in the Hofburg Treasury in Vienna in 1938. The air is heavy with the stillness of old power. Gold darkened by centuries. Iron that has outlived kingdoms. Glass cases holding objects once believed to legitimize emperors before crowds ever saw their faces. You would feel it immediately that this was never just metal. It was authority made tangible, a claim to destiny forged into matter. And Hitler understood symbols with a predator's instinct, not because he was a scholar, not because he was a mystic in the way later legends would insist, but because he knew what masses could be made to feel. He staged politics like ritual. He turned architecture into obedience. He turned rallies into liturgy. And when he ordered the regalia moved to Nuremberg in 1938, he was not simply relocating museum pieces. He was placing himself in the shadow of emperors. That matters, because Nuremberg was not chosen at random. It was the old home of the regalia. It was also the ceremonial heart of Nazism. At the city of rallies, the city of spectacle, the city where the regime wrapped itself in the remains of older legitimacies and dared the public not to notice the theft. The lance itself complicates the legend even further. Documented fact, the Vienna lance is not a Roman weapon from the time of the crucifixion. The imperial treasury dates it to the 8th century, and modern analysis has suggested a 7th century origin. In other words, the object Hitler seized was already wrapped in a myth older than the Nazis, but it was not the biblical spear in any verifiable sense. And still he wanted it there, not hidden, displayed. That is the first crack in the story. If Hitler truly believed he possessed a supernatural instrument of world rule, why make its greatest value public and theatrical instead of secret and ritualized? Why place it in Nuremberg where it could serve propaganda, lineage, spectacle? Because perhaps the real power was never in the spear. Perhaps it was in the audience. And once you begin to see that, the room changes around you. The object did not make the regime sacred. The regime needed the object so it could pretend that it already was. But this is where things take a darker turn. But what happens next changes everything. As the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, the story should have become simple. Bombs falling, cities burning, treasures hidden from destruction. That is the official shape of it, a relic moved for safekeeping in wartime chaos. But the archive tells a more unsettling story. Documented fact. In the final weeks of the war, the most important pieces of the regalia were separated from the larger cache. It documented fact. A fake handover was staged, and city officials later claimed the objects had been given to an unknown SS officer. That story was false. Under interrogation, one of the officials, Stadtrat Fries, broke and admitted the removal had been staged. The regalia had been hidden on March 31st, 1945, behind masonry in a chamber off a subterranean corridor in the Panierplatz bunker beneath Nuremberg. Not stored, walled in. That is not how people behave around an ordinary museum object. Why would anyone need to erase this? Why invent a phantom SS courier? Why conceal the last movement of the spear and the crown jewels of a dead empire while the Reich itself was already collapsing into ash? The names here matter. Willy Liebel, Nazi mayor of Nuremberg, was involved in the concealment and died by suicide in April 1945. Fries and Schmeissner helped sustain the false story. Walter Horn, the man who later tracked the regalia down, was a German-born Jewish refugee from Nazism, an art historian who had fled the Reich and returned in American uniform to interrogate the men who had hidden its theatre of power. That is the psychological layer no myth ever tells you. A relic mythologized by empire, weaponized by dictatorship, then recovered by a man the dictatorship had tried to erase. You would have made the same choice. Anyone would have, if you had lived inside a system where symbols could decide loyalty, where the wrong answer could cost your life, where even in the final days of total collapse, men were still lying about the location of a lance and a crown. You would have learned very quickly that objects were never just objects in the Third Reich, but they were signals, tests, oaths in metal form. This is where documented history and myth begin to blur. Documented fact: Hitler ordered the regalia moved from Vienna to Nuremberg in 1938. Documented fact: the lance itself is centuries too young to be the Roman spear from the crucifixion. Documented fact: on August 7, 1945, Lieutenant Walter Horn recovered the hidden regalia from the bunker in Nuremberg after a chain of interrogations exposed the fake story. What remains unknown is far more intimate. We do not possess a surviving document in which Hitler plainly states that he believed the lance had literal supernatural power. Some historians believe his fascination came less from occult faith than from Wagnerian myth, imperial symbolism, and the political usefulness of sacred lineage. Some believe the later image of Hitler as a black magical relic hunter was amplified far beyond the evidence, and some still argue that the intensity of the concealment points to beliefs deeper than propaganda alone. But here is the revelation that reorders the entire story. The spear may have been used twice. First, by the Nazis as a political relic, then by later myth makers as an occult relic. And both uses obscured the harder truth hiding in the archive. What they uncovered next was never meant to be public. Even at the end, they protected the symbol more carefully than human life. And this is where history stops making sense. If Hitler's search for the Spear of Destiny was only about theatre, then why does it keep opening onto a larger system of myth, secrecy and ideological ritual that stretched far beyond him? Well, because Hitler did not build that world alone. Around him stood men like Heinrich Himmler, who tried to turn the SS into something more than a police apparatus. In Himmler's imagination, it was an order, a brotherhood, a pseudo-chivalric elite with its own sacred centre at Wewelsburg Castle, its own myths, its own ceremonial hunger. The SS borrowed runes, medieval fantasies, knightly imagery, and racial pseudo-history, as if it were assembling a new religion from the ruins of older ones. The Ahnenerbe existed to give this hallucination an academic costume, That is the unexpected connection. The spear sits at the intersection of all of it: empire, invented lineage, Wagnerian longing, Nazi spectacle, SS mysticism, and the modern appetite for dark legend. And then I found something I wish I could unsee. The most powerful secret in this story was hidden in plain sight. The object was visible, catalogued, measured, displayed, studied, and yet the story attached to it became more important than the object itself. The so-called Spear of Destiny did not need to be authentic to become politically useful. It only needed to feel authentic inside a civilization already addicted to symbolic authority. That is how the cover-up really works. First, the Nazi state moved the regalia under the authority of power and wrapped them in revived imperial meaning. Then, as defeat approached, officials separated the most important pieces, staged a false transfer, and buried them behind a wall. The SS shadow hangs over that final concealment, and Horn's own investigation pointed toward Himmler's probable interest in separating the key regalia. Later, after the war, sensational retellings flooded the public imagination so completely that the archive itself was pushed to the margins. The Reich Main Security Office, the SS myth machine, the city administration in Nuremberg, and then decades of occult sensationalism, all of them helped turn evidence into fog. And once history is fogged, almost anything can be inserted into it. What does it mean when human beings stop asking whether a relic is true and begin asking whether it can rule them anyway? What does it mean when the keepers of memory, states, orders, archivists, publishers, ideologues, learn that a story with enough symbolic charge can outlive fact, outmarch evidence, and sometimes even bury the dead a second time? We like to think civilizations collapse from force alone, but often they are first hollowed out by theatre. And that is why this does not stay in 1938, because the mechanism is still with us. We still live among objects and images whose authority exceeds their truth. We still watch institutions wrap themselves in older symbols to appear inevitable. We still confuse spectacle with legitimacy. And every time myth outruns the archive, every time feeling defeats evidence, the old bunker door opens again. You are watching this, which means they didn't succeed completely. The wall was broken, the chamber was opened, the record did survive, but survival is not the same as understanding. So here is the real unanswered question at the center of Hitler's search for the Spear of Destiny. Who gave the final order to separate the most important regalia in late March 1945 and hide them behind that wall? And what exactly did they believe those objects still meant at the edge of total defeat? And this is where the story becomes disturbing. But the most disturbing part hasn't been told yet. I need you to sit with this for a moment. The spear was real. The legend was useful. And the difference killed people. Go back now to the beginning. Back to 1938. Back to Hitler ordering the regalia out of Vienna and into Nuremberg, as if history itself could be carried by rail and rearranged on command. At first glance it looks like possession, a dictator acquiring a sacred object. But after everything you have heard, it becomes something colder than possession. It becomes performance, a regime trying to inherit the emotional authority of dead empires because it could not generate enough legitimacy on its own. And that leaves one question at the center of everything. Or did Hitler search for the Spear of Destiny because he believed in its occult power, or because he understood the political power of making others believe? That question remains unresolved. It matters because the second possibility is far worse. If he truly believed, then this was delusion armed with state power. But if he did not believe and used the relic anyway, then myth itself becomes a weapon that needs no faith from the man wielding it. And there is one last detail, almost small enough to miss. The man who finally brought the hidden regalia back into the light was Walter Horn, a refugee the Reich had already cast out. Not a sorcerer, not a chosen guardian, just a scholar in uniform walking into the ruins to recover the symbols that had been used to sanctify the machine that expelled him. So perhaps the final terror is not that history hides its secrets. Perhaps it is that history leaves them in plain sight and waits to see who is willing to look without blinking. And if power can inherit the costume of truth often enough, how many of the stories governing us now are only older walls with fresher paint? Do you think this was hidden or intentionally erased? And more importantly, was Hitler chasing the spear itself, or the obedience that the legend surrounding it could create? Part 2 reveals the iron pin hidden inside the Vienna lance, and once you hear it, you'll understand why this channel exists. If this disturbed you, wait until you hear about Himmler's Grail obsession at Montserrat. The link is in the description. Send this to someone who still believes Hitler seized the spear because of supernatural power alone. Oh, well, but what happened next was far more disturbing than anyone expected.